All right, welcome to this second lecture in the series of the hierarchy of compassion worldwide of all times. And today we will focus on the topic of the awakening of humanity. Now, the importance of this topic cannot be overstated. It is about the history of each of us, about what makes us human, but also about how we came to be. And let's say in advance that according to Theosophia, how we became human was not merely a one-time creation by an outside God, beginning with a single human being. Nor did we arise as human beings because intelligent human consciousness fortuitously happened to arise from the evolution of the ape. We think it is necessary that instead of these two rather dominant but very incomplete theories, more knowledge about the Theosophical teachings is necessary, which moreover includes, integrates, and adds depth to both the symbolism behind the one theory and the scientific facts as a basis for the other. And also, which gives us much more meaning, because not only about our origins and about where we are now, but it also offers hints about how to continue our evolution today. Now, in many religions and traditions, there are explanations for the origin of man. These are mostly myths, stories full of symbolism. Usually, there is already a human-like figure, sometimes made of clay or of dust, but still mindless, without reason and without self-consciousness. He has yet to be inspired with thinking. His mind needs to be awakened. Sometimes the gods do not seem completely satisfied with the first human beings. Zeus wanted to destroy early man, but Prometheus, the Titan, a kind of divine giant from Greek mythology, prevents this. Eventually Zeus sent a flood over the world to wipe out men. Prometheus foresaw this and advised his human son Deucalion to build a ship, and in it he could survive the flood. The ship stranded on Mount Parnassus. Does it sound familiar? There are countless of these flood stories worldwide, and the most familiar to most of us here in the West, of course, is the one from Genesis. The Judeo-Christian God Jehovah also wants to get rid of the first human beings, the descendants from Adam. Only after a flood does he allow one of those he finds suitable, Noah, to repopulate the earth. He too gets stranded with its ark on a mountain, the Ararat. These are all symbolic stories with multiple meanings. Then there is the myth in which Prometheus stole the fire from the gods to give it to humanity. A story full of symbolism, and also this is not the only story about stealing the fire. As is the case with the flood story, there are dozens of myths worldwide about a god or hero or other being who steals the fire from the gods. And if you look, there are stories like this in Asia, to North and South America, from Africa to Oceania, and even within Europe from Germanic folklore tales to the Georgian Caucasus. There's a whole wiki page devoted to these stealing the theft of fire stories. Now, why the same symbolism over and over again? Because surely it's not really about the fire coming from the gods. Just look around you at how often forest fires occur, unfortunately, and how often lightning strikes. And also there has been volcanic activity for as long as the earth has existed. So those early human beings must have really known fire. So what would be the real meaning of this? And the same holds true of the story of the Garden of Eden, for example. Adam and Eve, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, tempted to do so by a serpent. The dogmatic religious have often tried to promote their story as the only true one, at the expense of others. They came to take those stories very literally, and also came to believe in that literal interpretation. Now, independent thinkers turned away from these dogmas and through science and other means brought to attention facts that could not be reconciled with the literalness of the religious interpretation. At some point, however, this led to a new belief, a materialistic scientific explanation as the only perspective by which global universal symbolism is dismissed as mere fabrications. Whereas the true scientist sees that we know very little for certain, and that at the very least, multiple theories or explanations are possible based on the same facts. Now there's only one reality, therefore there can only be one truth. So either one of these symbolic stories is the correct one, and the rest are not, as the religious adherents of every religion claim, or they are all false. They are all fabrications, as the adherents of scientific materialism say. Alternatively, and we think this is the most reasonable explanation, the various myths all give a piece of one and the same reality, but sometimes in the same and sometimes in slightly different symbolism. Consider the parable of the blind monks and the elephant, which we started with last week. Now each of the monks holding a different piece of the elephant, one still and saying it's a rope, another's leg and saying it's a tree, and a third having the elephant's trunk mistaking that for a snake, they all have a piece of reality. So why not investigate what is behind these perceptions? And that is exactly what Theosophy tells you to do. That behind all these myths and stories, there is one wisdom, one knowledge, one source, which you can also call the Theosophia, the wisdom of the gods or divine wisdom. And that wisdom offers a very logical explanation, which is that each of these myths have something to tell us, but should not be taken literally. They all describe a certain reality, and if you understand what symbolism they contain and what it stands for, and then hold the stories, also often with the same symbols, side by side, you will see that they all confirm each other and point to one and the same underlying wisdom and truth. And those explanations, moreover, do not appear to contradict scientific facts. Tonight's lecture is the second lecture of the second half of this season, in which we reflect on the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society by the hierarchy of compassion. And of course, in this lecture, we will repeat some key thoughts from last week about what we mean by that hierarchy of compassion. But really, that foundation of the Theosophical Society, 150 years ago, is just one of the countless impulses that have been undertaken from this hierarchy of compassion since 18 millions of years to bring more compassion, wisdom, and peace during these turbulent times in our human evolution. We will also dwell on that number of those 18 million years in this lecture. For how is this lecture structured? First, we will reflect on the question, what makes us human? After all, awakening already says that it's awakening something that is already there. So what is it that is being awakened in human beings, and what makes us human? Secondly, we will consider how that awakening of humanity took place. By whom or by what did it happen, and when? And how do we arrive at those 18 million years? And with the answer to these questions, we can also learn important lessons about how that awakening continues today. For examples, what are the lessons we can learn in the field of education, where that awakening is also involved? Like last week, this session has a lecture part, after which we have a study session on Zoom. The lecture will be between 45 and 60 minutes, and there's just a small difference compared to last week, because after the lecture we will take some time to answer a few questions in case there appear some in the chat of YouTube. But then we start our Zoom session that will not be broadcast via YouTube for privacy reasons. And in case you haven't signed up yet for the study on our website, please do so by sending an email to info@blavatskyhuis.org. Between the lecture and the Q&A, we have a small break of 3 minutes. And also good to tell, we have added a third part to the lecture of last week, which I did not do last week because of time constraints, but that part can now be watched on YouTube. So if you're curious, you can still check the recordings. All right, for those people who are just getting in at this lecture, let's make clear what the principles are that we base ourselves on. We mentioned three. First, the principle of boundlessness or infinity. That means that there is something that has always been, always is, and always will be. Eternal, immutable, and omnipresent. And it's something that you cannot give a name to, cannot attribute properties to, but which also cannot be eliminated from anything. Just as you cannot imagine a teapot without the space that encloses it. This first principle also implies unity, that nothing is really separate, because boundlessness also means that nothing can exist outside of it. And it also implies that there is boundless potential in each of us. In the boundless, there is no place for anything that's limited, that's not boundless in itself. And this already brings us to the second principle, that every being is essentially what we call a monad, a spark of eternity or ray of the boundless. And that ray or monad manifests cyclically. And that causes things to appear and disappear again. But really it is nothing but the ray that expands into a period of activity and withdraws in a period of rest. There are these exhales and inhales of consciousness, and they alternate all the time. Think also of ebb and flow, sleep and waking, and death and life. And finally, no cyclical phenomenon stands alone, but is made up of countless other lives in a karmic interrelation. Each life consists of less advanced lives and is itself part of a greater whole, of much more advanced consciousness. Just as we consist of life atoms, and we ourselves are again the life atoms of a cosmic solar being. In that hierarchical structure, each life goes through self-directed growth. Our life atoms eventually evolve into a human being, and we humans into superhuman consciousnesses that will one day embody itself in a sun. As above, so below. In one single image represented by the tetractys of Pythagoras, where each point represents a being and is part of a point above it and also directs two more points below it. And of course this goes beyond these 10 points because the hierarchies are infinite. However, you can classify them roughly as we saw last week. Thus there is a hierarchy of builders and a hierarchy of light or compassion, also called the architects. And the architects lay the pattern that the builders work with. So these hierarchies are never separate. In fact, every living being consists of both builders and architects. We as human thinkers, as architects, direct the builders, for example, the cellular beings who compose our bodies. But we also have in ourselves another higher part, like the monad we talked about. And actually, we as personality, who we are in this one outer life, are only a builder for that architect, who expresses himself over a whole number of lives. So as human beings, we are actually exactly in between these two hierarchies. If we identify with this outer life, with our body, our personality in this one life, then we are only a builder. But if we learn to unfold the mental, spiritual part in ourselves, then slowly but surely we become conscious as an architect, able to cooperate with the spiritual laws of nature. Now let us pick up the thread and look further into the evolution of this monad, that spiritual part. So it is this monad, that spark of eternity, or God spark, that originates in the boundless and then descends from the most spiritual realm to the most material plane. And that's why the Kabbalists say that the stone becomes a plant, an animal, a human being, a spirit, and the spirit a god. A thought we also find in Sufism, the esoteric movement of the Islam. And actually we should see this apart from the forms, the form of a mineral, the form of an animal, etc. Because it is in fact the monad, the spark, the consciousness, that learns by going through all these forms of the kingdoms of nature, through the mineral stage, the plant stage, the animal, the human, the spiritual, and the divine stage. But because everything proceeds in cycles, at each stage of evolution, you will have this so-called descending arc of material focus on behalf of the evolution of matter from spirit, after which there begins a so-called ascending arc, or spiritual focus, back upwards on behalf of the evolution of spirit from matter. And this is the most universal picture of evolution of consciousness. The evolution of the monad who gains experience in all kinds of areas, through all kinds of hierarchies of consciousness, and thus becoming a self-conscious God, divine being, or monad. Now, the evolution of human consciousness is, as above, so below, exactly the same process, but in the small, in the human sphere, in the human kingdom of nature. I say in the small, but this actually takes quite a while. It's basically to be completed in one embodiment of Earth, which, according to Theosophia, takes 4,320,000,000 of years. Although the monad is essentially limitless, when it gains experience in the human kingdom of nature, it becomes known as the human monad. And it is at this human stage that self-consciousness is developed. And this happens around the bottom of the descending arc. Because then, under the guidance of the spiritual, the material is constituted in such a way that it's ready to express the spiritual. And it's precisely around this point that the human can awaken. Now, this is not purely an individual matter, because we always evolve and grow in connection with one another. And moreover, there is always help from the hierarchy of compassion that's always there to inspire. So there's always inspiration from these beings working on the light side, who stop their own evolution to inspire others to complete their evolution. Just as educators, parents, teachers sort of halt their own upward evolution to assist their children on their downward evolution in order to then go upward on their own. You could see how we reflect the hierarchies of light or compassion in the great cycles of life. And so actually the different kingdoms of nature also play a role to help each other in their evolution. Let's look again at the ladder of life containing the different monadic classes or kingdoms of nature, as we introduced them last week. So the monad goes from the originating Dhyani Johanic kingdoms as an unconscious God spark through the three elemental kingdoms with very elemental consciousness, and then proceeding to the mineral kingdom. After that, it goes through the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. Now, in the human kingdom, the monad reaches this stage of self-consciousness. We can then rise through the active line or ascending arc to the three so-called Dhyani Johanic kingdoms or divine kingdoms, but then with self-consciousness. We then are beings who have reached the superhuman or divine level of consciousness self-consciously. And then we can make the stop to higher cosmic planes to start the same cycle, but on another, more elevated plane of consciousness. Now, as a monad in each cycle of this planet, each embodiment of this earth, we have the opportunity to complete the evolution in one kingdom of nature, and thus enter the next kingdom of nature. And we repeat again, the stone becomes a plant, the plant becomes an animal, the animal becomes a human, the human a spirit, the spirit a God. But from compassion, the kingdoms of nature, you could say, pass the baton, so to speak, to each other. Out of compassion, they actively help one another to make the grade, so to say. And the secret doctrine also speaks of the golden age, when the gods walked the earth and interacted freely with mortals, as is also said of Enoch in the Old Testament. It was the time before the divine beings became invisible to us on the external plane. It were these Dhyani Choans, who themselves were human beings in the previous embodiment of this earth, who inspired us and awakened the human in us. An event that was partly karmic and partly pure compassion. Now we will come back to this in more detail in the next section. For now it is just about the big picture. It shows the cooperation between consciousnesses who are more advanced and those who are less advanced. As briefly expressed by Godfried de Perucker, the fourth leader of the TS, that life is a school and men are the pupils in that school, and in that school there are teachers. And he adds, in these few words you have the key to the whole situation and to the policy of the Great Lodge. And by Great Lodge, GDP means the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, the human department of the hierarchy of compassion on earth. We now return for a moment to the question, what is it that makes us human beings human? Now every being, including human beings, is composite. We are also basically a hierarchy. We have an imperishable part, the monad, the boundless ray or spark of eternity. At the other hand, we have a perishable part, the vehicle, composed again itself of hierarchies of countless living beings. But we are, in fact, the learning part, learning to express something of the boundless potentiality of the monad. Now, if you look at our composite in a little more detail, you can also make a division into 7 principles. We humans are now learning to express the 5th of the 7 principles as counted from below, the Manas principle, the mind or thinking faculty. And that thinking faculty enables us to perceive thoughts. We make mental representations and we can reflect on them and we can direct our thinking. Because that Manas principle, that thinking faculty, is itself also 7-fold. And we can distinguish 7 aspects of thinking for ourselves, from the most limited to the widest we can imagine. And if we learn to properly distinguish these thinking aspects, as we do in our course Universal Wisdom, then you can also learn to direct your thinking. Because the more we focus our thinking on the higher, the more widening aspects, the more the other aspects underneath it will also find their proper place. In other words, the most harmonious thinker uses all aspects, but guided from the highest or most inner aspect of the sense oneness, which actually includes all the others. So you can analyze your own thinking based on these 7 thinking aspects and give it more direction. But then, when we look around us, we don't always see the examples of broad or widening thinking. And that has to do with our stage of evolution. We've explained that the monad basically goes through the evolution of consciousness of a kingdom of nature during one embodiment of the planet, a duration of 4,320,000,000 years. In other words, we humans can evolve into universal humans during that period of time. And this occurs in 7 major phases, analogous to the 7 principles. And those phases of hundreds of millions of years each are called the rounds in Theosophy. And each round, again, consists of 7 subphases, of also tens of millions of years. And we can call these classes, again corresponding to the 7 principles, but as subdivisions. So we get the picture of 49 of these classes. And these classes still each last millions of years, and in them we thus go through thousands of cycles or embodiments or incarnations. And as you can see in this picture, in our evolution we are actually just past the halfway point. So the average human thinking is not that much more advanced than the kama sub-aspect of that, or thinking characterized by the desire principle. We are now on average in the 4th round and in the 5th class of that 4th round. Or in other words, we are in an intellectual substage of the stage of desire thinking. And we, as an average human being, are currently in the process of mastering the desire thinking and are doing that with our intellect or mind. But you actually see also that desire is often leading and the intellect is employed for the purpose of the desire. So we are really only half human right now. We still have a lot to learn. But we can be positive because the glass is just a little bit more than half full, at least for the average human being, leaving aside any laggards and also forerunners. And thanks to the Theosophia that is constantly provided by the hierarchy of compassion, we can also learn to discern in ourselves how to direct our evolution. Because as a human being, as the learning middle part between the imperishable and perishable part, we have the choice to identify with our thinking with either of the two parts in ourselves. And this is in fact the self-consciousness that is awakened with the development of our thinking. You can also describe self-consciousness as the ability to self-identify, to form a thought image of yourself, of how you want to be, how you want to act, and to what end. Is that image of yourself composed primarily of who you are externally, your personality, how you are perceived, the role you play in this life of wanting a certain house, a certain partner maybe, a certain appearance, a certain salary? A somewhat limited and limiting image. Because that's only the identification with the I am I, the personality in this outer life, which thinks itself separate from others, so to speak. And actually, you then stare blindly at only at that which you see, which outwardly may seem real, but which is precisely the most illusory because transitory. For everything we possess in terms of matter, our body, including our personality, is indeed impermanent, perishable. Now you can also identify with the individual behind the persona, because persona literally means mask. And behind the mask is the actor who takes on another role every life. This is the real human being, who is primarily engaged in the development of the higher thinking aspects, the development of wisdom, of truth, and compassion, who cherishes universal, compassionate thoughts and ideals. It is our reincarnating self, of which our conscience is also a part. And in those moments when you identify with it, you know you are one with everything else. You forget yourself and therefore act selflessly. So now we are a little past halfway through our evolution. And this can also be recognized in the duality of the average people's thinking. We recognize both perspectives in ourselves, but still oscillate between limited personal thinking and truly human, compassionate thinking. And it is self-consciousness that forms the most essential characteristic of what makes us human. In the words of de Brucker, briefly, a steadily growing sense of moral and intellectual responsibility. It is this that makes us truly human, that we can learn, that we can grow and develop an ever wider, wiser, more compassionate and moral responsibility. And in doing so, we can also take responsibility for our own growth and evolution. We can focus our thinking, identify ourselves with an ever wider part of the one life. And the more we recognize and nurture this human element in ourselves, the faster we will grow and also will become more human and more compassionate. Now, with this, we have clarified what makes us human. We will now address how the awakening of humanity, the awakening of this growing sense of moral and intellectual responsibility took place exactly, and why it happened 18 million years ago. Now, we've already told that the monad gains experience in the various kingdoms of nature and thus evolves. We also told that the beings in each kingdom of nature have the task of helping their fellow beings in the kingdoms of nature below to go through their evolution. So, for example, the semi-divine beings from the Dhyani-Chohanic kingdom helped humanity to awaken. We're going to explain how the awakening of mankind took place, and starting with a little bit of repetition from last week. We then reflected on the concept of hierarchy as a layering of levels of consciousness or spheres of life guided by a hierarch, the first, the leader, the starting point, who inspires all of the hierarchy with a particular field of influence. Now, every life is hierarchical structured from such a hierarch. It consists of countless gradations of lives interacting with each other. So there's always life within life, cycles within cycles, captured in one symbol by the tetractys of Pythagoras. Now there's an important concept that we want to add when it comes to the emergence of such a hierarchy, namely the process of emanation, which literally means flowing out. It means that the field of influence flowing out from a hierarch has a certain magnetic attraction to less advanced beings who share the same characteristic. These then re-enter that cooperation within that hierarchy, within that sphere of influence, and they in turn, with their sphere of influence, attract beings below it, and so on. And this is exactly what the beings in the hierarchy of light or compassion do to the beings in the hierarchy of builders. The architects radiate a field of influence of compassion, an atmosphere of inspiration within which the builders can develop themselves. And similarly, there has been the impulse of the so-called Manasaputras, literally the sons of mind. It was the descent of these semi-divine beings that awakened humanity 18 million years ago. To begin, let's look at how this story was told in well-known myths, with some keys to better understand its symbolism. We begin briefly with the most familiar story here in the West, from Genesis, the first book of the Bible, in which is told how Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, tempted to do so by a serpent. Now, the tree is an ancient symbol for sacred or hidden knowledge or wisdom, often guarded by snakes or dragons, like a dragon guarding the tree of the with the golden apples of the Hesperides, according to Greek mythology, or the luxuriant trees and vegetation of Mount Meru from Eastern traditions, also guarded by a snake. The snakes or dragons in these stories represent the sages or teachers who both protect and spread the wisdom represented by the tree. So would the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve really mean harm? The golden apples from the tree of the Hesperides were a wedding gift from Gaia to Zeus and Hera, and bestowed immortality on the one who ate from it. And eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from the Garden of Eden, while meaning insight into both good and evil, also means the end of ignorance. Not necessarily something negative, you would say. It also, of course, refers to what we named in the first part as what makes a human being human. The emergence of thinking, which also implies moral responsibility. The recognition of good and evil in oneself. Or in other words, to discern between that limited part in us that is primarily self-centered and wants to pursue its own interests, versus the reincarnating part in us. Conscientious, intuitive, wise, compassionate, unselfish. An awakening is the moment when we become self-conscious, which is also represented in the story by Adam and Eve suddenly seeing themselves as naked and becoming ashamed of each other. Now Adam and Eve, through the wisdom of the serpent, become self-conscious and thus awaken from their childlike state in paradise. And as a result, the serpent is punished. Actually, the same thing that happened to Prometheus. Prometheus, literally meaning he who is prescient, who anticipates or sees into the future, from the Greek pro-metis, literally meaning forethought or foreknowledge. He was a Titan, one of the early divine beings in Greek mythology. And he's best known for stealing the fire of the gods and giving it to humans out of love for humanity. He's also described as a teacher who brought people to civilization, teaching them writing, arithmetic, as well as how to practice agriculture, medicine, and science. Now the chief god Zeus punished Prometheus for stealing the fire, just as the serpent was punished by Jehovah for tempting Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The serpent is forced to crawl across the earth, and Zeus punishes Prometheus by tying him up in the Caucasus Mountains. There a vulture comes daily to pick out his liver, and that liver grew back during the night, so the torment began all over again the next day. And of course, as we mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we should not take the fire he stole and gave to humanity literally. Prometheus is the giver of the intellectual and spiritual fire in man. He stands for the collective of divine beings who, partly out of compassion and partly karmically, ignited the capacity for thinking and the divine flame of self-consciousness in man. They gave us light, reason, and understanding and opened our eyes. We became self-conscious, and like eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we became responsible for our thoughts and deeds. Now the collective of wise beings that are represented by Prometheus and by the serpent from the Garden of Eden are also referred to in Theosophia as the Manasaputras. This word literally means sons of mind. It are higher developed spiritual beings. And they awakened the manas of manas, the human part within a human being. They awakened the thinking in the thinker and consequently the self-consciousness. Now those Manasaputras are also called our higher selves that incarnated in us. Not our highest selves and not exactly ourselves either, but they are individual beings. And we at the time were actually those still half asleep beings in whom independent thinking had yet to awaken. But as we have already explained, the principles of Theosophia teach us that every being is connected, even in essence one with all others. And this connectedness is sometimes so close that one can speak of one and the same ray of consciousness with different foci or transformers. Again, think of this tetractys and that idea of emanation. And so the Manasaputras can be seen as higher focal points in the same ray, the same stream of consciousness, of which we are also a focal point ourselves. Now, how did that awakening from the Manasaputras work? They accomplished that by awakening something of their own ability in ourselves, just as when you light another candle with the fire of one flame. In fact, the Manasaputras radiated their thinking in such a way that we can pick it up on our level. And it works according to the principle of resonance. Namely, that if you emit a certain vibration, vibrations of a force or vibrations of a similar characteristic will vibrate along with it. just as striking an F note on a piano makes the other F strings in the other octaves also vibrate along with it. Now, why did this process take place 18 million years ago? As told in our present stage of evolution, we are just past the halfway point. And note again that each round thus means hundreds of millions of years of evolution of the monad, and that each round itself is divisible into 7 classes of still tens of millions of years each. Now, if we then show what 18 million years ago means on this scale, then this is only a fraction of our total evolution. If we take 18 million years out of our whole evolutionary cycle of over 4 billion years, then this event is only a relative short time ago. Now in this diagram we can see that the awakening took place in the 4th round, the round we are still in now. The round in which the development of the kama, or desire principle of thinking, is brought to fruition. Theosophy goes on to say that this started about halfway down the 3rd class of that 4th round. Now why did these Manasaputras appear then? Because in the 3rd class of the 4th round, humanity had an opening to receive their inspiration. Firstly, the 4th principle had to be sufficiently developed to serve as a vehicle for the 5th. But further, it happened in the 3rd class, because that's also the moment when the manas, or thinking, involutes, or takes root in one's consciousness. And that's exactly why the Manasaputras were able to do their work at that moment. And of course, that was not just a single moment, but a process that did take several hundred thousands of years, and you could say, in fact, is still going on now. Now, what were we like in that 3rd class of the 4th round, before we actually became truly human? Now we see that thinking and self-consciousness was activated in us by the Manasaputras, while we as human monads were still in a sub-stage, or of, you could say, prana development, a rather childlike stage in a kind of paradisiacal state. Now it's not that we were without thinking capacity or totally unconscious. You could say we were comparable to a child who is not yet thinking independently, like a child between, say, 5 to 7 years old. There's already a foreshadowing of thinking, but actually it was mostly instinctive. And we humans of that time had flashes of intuition, we had feelings, and also the vague consciousness of children. But we did not yet possess real reason, real mind, or intellect. So thinking and self-consciousness were not yet in existence. And that, without the descent of the Manasaputras, would have taken many hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It can be compared to a child who would grow up in isolation without parents, like feral children, for example, who, as a result of growing up among wolves or other beasts, fall so behind that it cannot make up in the rest of their incarnation. Now, when the Manasaputras taught us and awakened our thinking, we were like these young children, devoutly following their parents' upbringing. As just starting thinkers, we relied completely on the beings who were ahead of us in evolution. But just as childhood transitions into adolescence, in which desire thinking takes on a greater role, so did we collectively as humanity enter the puberty stage when reaching the 4th grade after the 3rd grade. Especially at the nadir halfway, in the 4th class of the 4th round, that is, with a double desire characteristic. Now, desire is a neutral principle, but the evolution starts with a period when especially the lower directed desire begins to express itself. That is, the desire focused on the material, on externals. And because our thinking faculty was already awakened, this intellect could be employed to pursue and gratify those external, illusory, and often selfish desires. For some, this meant cunning and cleverness thus became more important than wisdom. And we entered what we call the Atlantic Age, in which there was much selfish desire. The wisdom of the Manasaputras then had to be protected from misuse for personal gain. We will discuss this further next week when we will talk about the mystery schools that were established for that purpose. Now, in fact, this is the punishment of the Manasaputras, that they enlivened our thinking even before we passed through the lowest point of desire. And this has made them co-responsible for our selfish use of thinking to satisfy personal desires. And they are karmically co-responsible for that. They may have disrupted natural development, but in a sense they have been punished for their compassionate act of accelerating our awakening as human beings. Yet, foresighted as they were, as the name of Prometheus also suggests, they knew exactly what they were doing at the time. The early development of self-consciousness offered man freedom of thought and made us the only free actor in nature, so to speak. And only with that still immature thinking could we make decisions ourselves and also wrong decisions by pursuing our selfish desires, leading to all kinds of disharmony, discontent, and injustice. Something we still see the consequences of. Now, this is why the Manasaputras, like the snake, are doomed to meander in the outer desire world. It's these lower desires and tendencies of humanity that figuratively chained Prometheus to the rock. And the vulture picking out his liver, of course, too is symbolic, for it represents the ever unsatisfied desire that still pecks daily at the Manasaputra's liver. It refers to the personal and animal desires and inclinations that can never be permanently fulfilled, because they go out to perishable things in outer life, material wealth, status, personal glorification, animal pleasure, luxury, comfort, etc. Nevertheless, the Manasaputras chose this fate out of compassion, because otherwise humanity would remain for aeons still kind of childlike, just instinctive dreaming without really self-consciousness, without real progress, without learning any moral and ethical lessons, even from the misdeeds we might commit. And partly this was also a karmic obligation, compensating for an earlier delay in evolution that they themselves caused in a previous cycle, a period when we were still in the animal kingdom, while they were in the human kingdom. Now, when we look again with this knowledge at the choices we make daily, the motives from which we act, we hopefully understand that we also have a responsibility toward these Manasaputras, to give up the personal, the limited and limiting, and to become truly human, selfless, compassionate, to which they have inspired us and still are inspiring us. Now, having explained the theosophical idea of the awakening of humanity through the Manasaputras, now 18 million years ago, we're going to go into how the awakening can work now. Or in other words, how to recognize and apply this wisdom in the practice of our daily lives, especially in the upbringing and educational field. Because basically this is a reflection of what took place in our evolution as human beings. As we cited before, life is a school, people are students in that school, and in that school there are teachers. Now, before we touched on the fact that those teachers who awakened humanity 18 million years ago were in fact the people of a previous embodiment of this planet, who had now entered the Dhyani Johanic realm, means that they are incipient divine consciousnesses. Now, there are different classes of these Dhyani Johans, just as there is difference between human beings now. And as you can imagine, there will be difference in the evolution of human beings when we have come to the end of this embodiment of Earth. And just as with a new school year, each one of us simply begins again where he left off, and no steps are skipped. A few may have dropped out, but what they learned once in a particular class, they have not lost. And so they have a head start in a new class, which they can use to benefit others. In one picture, here again all the 10 monadic classes of this planet. Now the classes in which the monads gain experience in order to come to self-conscious activity of their inner heavenly or divine faculties are all these classes together. But the higher classes can consciously choose from compassion to assist in the evolution of the previous classes, because they truly recognize universal brotherhood as a fact, and they will also naturally do so. Now, with this knowledge, we see that our responsibility extends in all directions, not only upward, but also downward, for example, toward the animal kingdom. And when you see how we treat the animals now, just think of the bioindustry, you can imagine that we, as coming Manasaputras, will also have something to repair karmically when the monads in the animal kingdom of now will then enter the human kingdom. So this is the theosophical picture of life as an infinite school of consciousness. In other words, Theosophia assumes hierarchical structure, processes of emanation, the emanation of spheres of influence or fields for more highly developed consciousnesses, in which less highly developed consciousnesses can go through their evolution or growth. It can thus be seen as a continuous awakening of essentially boundless consciousness in unison. Before going into the awakening of humanity and how it works now, in this section we will briefly juxtapose the theosophical teachings with current theories of the origin of man, such as the neo-Darwinian idea and the creation theory. We will show that these modern myths leave very many questions unanswered, questions that can very well be answered with the Theosophia. To start with the first, neo-Darwinism. The assumption is that man evolved from the apes, based on the principle of natural selection. And underlying this is the so-called random change of form, because cells would mutilate by chance, traits sometimes emerge that make a species suitable for survival. If man evolved from the ape, the question remains as to where the so-called missing link can be found. Surely something of a transitional form between the ape and man should be found in history, because now the gap is quite large. Still, it hasn't been found. Another outstanding question with neo-Darwinian theory is the role of chance. For example, it is hypothesized that random mutations of genes suddenly caused intelligent consciousness. But if one looks at how often mutations occur and then looks at the probability theory, one has to conclude that this is very far-fetched. There appears to be a fairly orderly process going on much more often. Copy errors in the DNA of cells are made very infrequently. And sometimes, as if from nowhere, exactly the necessary characteristics suddenly seem to emerge. Moreover, the world around us shows all orderliness. We can describe all kinds of laws of nature and thus predict and calculate more and more precisely what can take place. It's not coincidence, then just a word to hide our ignorance behind the cause and effect relationships we haven't yet discovered. There's also increasing doubt about the idea that life is only about survival, about the struggle for existence, a life that seems otherwise directionless and meaningless. For there is undeniably a great deal of cooperation in nature. Symbiosis. There's indeed interdependence and connection. And surely every human being also experiences something of morality. Indeed, we see this as something that gives our life direction, that gives our lives meaning, which doesn't fit into the rather meaningless materialistic picture of only surviving a once in a lifetime. Never mind the excesses of social Darwinism that have taken place based on this theory. It was even used to justify making others suffer for their circumstances. Now, the second theory for how man came to be is what is called creationism, a theory of creation. This says that man was created by God, or gods, as everyone knows from the Judeo-Christian as well as the Islamic religion. Also, with creationism, there are many unresolved questions. For if an omnipotent God created this universe and man, to what purpose exactly? Just to make a human being prove something this one life, only to then send him to heaven or hell forever? And is there free will then? If there is a God who has already determined everything? Is there even responsibility? And what about all those people who are not of the same faith? Who don't acknowledge your God or don't even know your God? Are they all doomed? And why then does this God create such an imperfect world, full of suffering and full of evil? Where does that come from? And among people of faith, there is just as much violence. Often faith is even the cause of it. So, how about that? So, the Theosophical idea of the process of emanation and the continuous awakening of essentially boundless consciousness does offer answers to these questions. It gives us a clear picture of the meaning of life, that through our own development we can build an ever wider sense of universal brotherhood, of the spiritual unity of life, of our moral responsibility. A development that never ends, but reaches ever higher, ever further, leading more and more to unity and harmony. And this growth also happens on the basis of free will, on the basis of self-expression of the faculties that are dormant in us, according to the responsibility that we can build ourselves. And evil, in fact, is not something that exists by itself. There is imperfection in that development, and that temporary ignorance creates the disharmony we see in the world. Unfortunately, of course, there's even conscious choosing of something while knowing better, which is the really evil. But even that, in a sense, is a form of imperfection, out of ignorance. As we have explained, it is the misuse of faculties from a limited worldview, a limited vision, that leads to mutual strife, to discontent and injustice. And it's due to the illusion that we are separate from each other, an illusion that will one day dissolve, after which we cannot imagine that we could ever have acted this way. Now, none of this is meant to convince you in a few minutes, but hopefully to make you sufficiently curious about more, or to help you with ideas to make others curious, that the Theosophical teachings deserve at least more considerations. Finally, the most important reason why these teachings are worth further study is because they give us direct application in our everyday lives. And then we return for a moment to how the Manasaputras awakened our thinking. So in the process of awakening or igniting, there's no putting something from outside into something that is not already there internally. Like the candle is its own fuel, but only needs to be ignited. Thus the Manasaputras surrounded us with their sphere of thought, so that slowly but surely our own thinking became enlightened. We already called this the principle of resonance. And just as the striking of a note on the keyboard causes the other notes of the same vibrational characteristic to vibrate along with it. Now, as above, so below, the principle of analogy is one of the central principles in Theosophy. And universality also means that patterns repeat themselves. And so we actually repeat every incarnation, every life cycle, in miniature what actually happened throughout our history as humanity on Earth. With a difficult word, we also call this recapitulation. It's a word that comes from embryology. And this is because at the embryonic stages, we see how each embryo goes through the forms again from earlier stages of evolution. But this is only the outside, because internally, from the consciousness point of view, this is also going on. Where in the womb we go through the earlier rounds again at an accelerated rate, so after birth we go through the development or in an evolution of consciousness of the previous 5 classes from this 4th round again, until sometime in our 20s we become adults again and continue to learn. And it's this whole in an evolutionary process of us as humanity, but then accelerated in a single lifetime, a single incarnation. Now all these aspects of consciousness come back into play in it sequentially. We rebuild the body during the baby phase as the sense of oneness influence. Feelings then emerge in the toddler phase, while the first early insights and intuition also wrap in. Then we learn to express vitality, and slowly but surely, between the ages of 5 and 7 years old, we master it as the intellect starts to work. Then at puberty you see the 2 desires at work. The lower directed towards one's own personality, oneself, which wants to be independent, but at the same time the higher directed, the idealism, still somewhat clumsily. And this desire is increasingly brought under the control of the intellect, our reason, and the conscience, built up in previous incarnations with certain insights and moral responsibility. And then we are again at the point where our evolution has reached so far and we pick up the thread as adults. Now we see that in the 3rd stage, around the 5th to 7th year, slowly but surely independent thinking and self-consciousness begins to develop. Now we have talked in the story of the Garden of Eden about the moment we become self-conscious, when Adam and Eve suddenly saw themselves as naked and begin to be ashamed of each other. Now shame is also a first sign that children are developing self-consciousness. For shame implies empathy for how others see them. From about the age of 7, children are more likely to, for instance, lock the toilet door or hold a towel around them while changing clothes. Both signs of this developing self-consciousness. So it's precisely from this age that educators, like parents, teachers, grandfathers, grandmothers, etc., more or less function as the Manasaputras did, as illuminators of the incipient thinking of the child. And actually also as temporary higher selves, you could say. Parents and educators have the opportunity to bring out the thinking in a harmonious way, by awakening the higher aspects of the mind simultaneously with the development of the lower ones, so that the child learns to know and to control himself. Now this happens not just through words. Just as the Manasaputras awakened our thinking by surrounding us in their own atmosphere, so the child's thinking is awakened by the atmosphere of the family, or the atmosphere of the classroom, in which it grows up or is taught. And this is not so much awakened by something that somebody does, it is ignited by who these people actually are, what they radiate day in, day out. So to give a wrong example, if someone is locked on his cell phone in front of his child, that's obviously destructive to this atmosphere that he surrounds his child with. But let's pay particular attention to the good examples, as we described one of these examples in the latest edition of our magazine Lucifer, the Lightbringer. This is about an elementary school teacher who wanted to do something about the reading level of her students. She did not wear them out with exercises in reading comprehension or extra dictation. But most importantly, by being the example herself, by simply starting to read during reading time at the front of the class. Now, most of her elementary school 6th graders increased their reading level to that of a 12th grader within a year and a half. Again, resonance is the principle. This elementary school teacher really knows very well what she is doing. She knows the children's literature and was soon literally going through the library with a garbage bag to get rid of a lot of books that were, in her eyes, totally unchallenging. She enjoys reading children's books herself and then telling her class about the book she likes, which leads to her students, as she herself says, to eagerly look at the book I'm reading right now and ask me to hurry up so they can start to read it themselves. She also talks to her students about what interests them and then recommends books. So in short, her whole atmosphere is surrounded by authentic enthusiasm for reading. And that resonates, that enthuses her students to read, with amazing results. It's a good example of education in the literal meaning of leading out what is already present internally. I would say read the article for yourself. You can download it in the latest issue of our magazine Lucifer the Lightbringer from our website blavatskyhouse.org. So you see, the lessons from the process of the awakening of humanity is something we can apply daily. And if we connect this again with the broad view of humanity that Theosophia outlines to us, that which makes us human, that constant growing sense of moral and intellectual responsibility, then hopefully it's more clear that we have to do what we have to do to play a role in this. For with this knowledge, each of us is able to contribute in this process to make each other more human as human beings. Okay, we will now pause 3 minutes and then we have some short time for questions, and then we will stop this broadcast on YouTube and continue our study via Zoom. See you in a minute. Yes, Pauk, are there any questions?
We have one question.
Yeah.
At some point, you mentioned in your lecture that we became free actors. And the question is, are gods no free actors?
So that's an interesting question, because you could say, in a sense yes, and in a sense no, because the yes means because there is always free will. So and actually the free will grows with the consciousness, and the wiser we are, the larger is our free will, because we understand these processes better. I always give this example. If you know how to speak a language in a certain country, you have more freedom than if you don't. But the other side is that as we grow, as conscious become more conscious, and also, well, more on the divine level, we get more insight in these laws of nature. So we actually see how things should work, how nature works, how we can really become more responsible for our thoughts and deeds and make them in line with the harmony of nature. So actually what happens is that the higher these beings progress, the more they say they become servants of the law. So they consciously, out of free will, actually line up their actions, their deeds, their consciousness with the laws of nature. So in that sense, they're, you could say, less free than we are now at our human phase, but that's more out of ignorance that we still do these stupid things that they wouldn't think of anymore. So I think that's more or less the answer I can give now.
Yes, thank you. Well, that was the only question.
Okay, thank you. So we will now then stop our broadcast. So if you haven't signed up, maybe if you're really quick, send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org, then we still can add you to the Zoom, and then we will now continue our study via Zoom. I want to say a little bit about next week. So we have now talked about the awakening, and Next week we will discuss further how that awakening, you could say, progressed, and also what was the reason for the founding of the mystery schools. Actually, the schools that started, you could say, at the depth of our human development to protect the misuse of wisdom from, that came to us from these higher spheres of consciousness. And also the schools that actually were the source for every great religion, philosophy, and science that man has known so far. So that's what we all will discuss next week. And then I'd like to close with Gayatri. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.